All right, David, after some technical snafus, we are live here. I apologize to you and the audience. That was exceedingly frustrating, what just went on there. Don't know what was happening. You know, David, there was an explosion late last night around 9:30 p.m. in Astoria, Queens, a borough of New York City that's very close to LaGuardia Airport. I understand there was a power outage at the airport, and people are saying it lit up the sky in blue, even joking about UFO invasion or something like that. How are you this fine day, David?
Well, whenever I hear UFO or alien invasions, I'm reminded of Christine Marcy's launch of the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System. So I think the aliens are coming from inside the gates rather than from another planet. Over to you.
It's so, I mean, you know, you and I were on the phone this morning getting very prepared for the show. I had lots of links and things I was going to bring up for everyone, but then at the moment when we normally just get online and do a sound check, everything exploded. And we had a substantial delay. It really took up until just a moment ago to get things working. It's still not working properly. But, and of course, you know, we are prone to ask the question, is this active measures or is this just a confluence of computer failures that are occurring randomly? I certainly have no empirical evidence that it's anything other than a sequence of coincidences, so I don't want to jump to any conclusions that aren't founded. David, I do want to remind everyone who's watching that this portion of the show we're putting out here on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook and all of the free platforms that we utilize, but of course, people can support the show by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and they can also support Crowdsource the Truth by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Right now we're looking for alternatives to Patreon because people are largely unhappy with their ongoing decision to completely forego the First Amendment, to openly admit that they do not support freedom of speech. And that's a problem, but unfortunately, David, I'm not in the financial situation to be able to just turn my back on Patreon. I want to get an alternative in place so that our sponsors can have somewhere to go to receive the exclusive content that we put out in the Only on Patreon show. And of course, that'll be coming up right after this at 3 p.m. People can see it at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. We're going to be talking today, David, about this carbon credit system that you've brought to my attention. I was aware of it vaguely, but had never known the degree to which it really does seem to be a financial scam. It's essentially a stock market, a trading market where these carbon credits are basically financial instruments. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, totally. And so what I've done is I put the clock back to 1988 and thinking of some of the exciting things that went on there. It turns out that N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, the fifth oldest British bank, appears to have set up what is known as a dark pool of funds with the initial public offering of a company called SERCO onto the London Stock Exchange. And these dark pool of funds represent today well over $100 trillion of assets under management. And what's really interesting, I think, for Americans, with respect to, for example, the crash of Pan Am 103, right through to the 9/11 attacks and the deaths and devastations that have taken place since, is to explore the possibility with us, Jason, find anyone else able to explore it in any real time or depth, the possibility that these dark pool of funds set up by N.M. Rothschild with the IPO of SERCO are actually being used to provide a negotiable instrument, let's call it a carbon credit, to criminal groups that are able to neutralize the carbon footprint of people, for example, flying on Pan Am 103, where you get my drift. One way of reducing someone's carbon footprint is to kill them. Or another way is to take their homes in California, for example, and zap the homes with microwave radiation from multiple satellites controlled through an outfit called Maxar Technologies, which used to be McDonnell Detweiler and Associates, which I believe is intimately connected with wrongful deaths at the pig farm. Over to you.
Yes, the pig farm is something that we definitely want to talk about today. We had the opportunity to speak to Wilbur Ross. You know, I've been contacted, David, we discussed this briefly in our conversation before we began. I've been contacted by a woman in Canada who is personal friends with someone whose mother was murdered at the pig farm. And this person questions some of the things that we've said and discussed about Robert Pickton and how that all went down. So I think we want to try to explore that further and see what information this person could share with us. Now, just briefly to touch on Wilbur Ross, because SERCO and the IPO that was handled by N.M. Rothschild. So would Wilbur Ross have been employed at SERCO, or rather at N.M. Rothschild in 1988 when this was happening?
Oh, totally. He was, and he did a number of interesting things. He arranged to roll over Trump's debts, where the creditors were thinking seriously about forcing Trump into bankruptcy. And he, with Icahn, managed to persuade them to let Trump keep going, doing what Trump is particularly good at, which is borrowing money to finance his expansion, as opposed to finding investors to put money in and risk losing it. Now, of course, there's a moral hazard there, because if an outfit as powerful as SERCO, which I think is essentially a dark pool of funds, institutional funds, when it rolls over the debts, it wants a quid pro quo. And what we're straying into is loan sharking.
Loan shark.
I believe now that SERCO, SERCO, with that IPO, set itself up as a way of recovering money for creditors. One of the ways of, for example, of recovering money might be to buy insurance on both towers in New York 6 weeks before they were demolished. Mm-hmm. And so when they came down on the same day, they could have triggered a catastrophe bond where the claim was double the value of the 99-year mortgage. And the 99-year mortgage was arranged through Wells Fargo with, I believe, a cartel of bankers, including Citigroup, which I think had loaned $380 million to Donald Trump to finance Trump Shuttle Inc. And of course, if they decided that they wanted to recover their money through alternative financial markets, what better way to say, all right, Donald, one day we're going to make you president and we expect you to pay us back. Well, Wilbur Ross, of course, is in the perfect position, because now Wilbur Ross is the Commerce Secretary, and underneath the Commerce Secretary is the responsibility, you could call it the de facto custody, of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, where SERCO last month completed the processing of the 4 millionth patent, which Wilbur Ross didn't seem to want to talk to you about. Over to you.
Yeah, he was very explicit about not wanting to talk about it. He wanted to talk about space, which, you know, I get it. Space is quite interesting, and that's what he wanted to talk about. David, something that's occurred to me since meeting Wilbur Ross last week, you know, Robert Mueller has been so aggressive in pursuing anyone who is remotely connected to Donald Trump and trying to find any connection, no matter how tenuous, to Russian business interests. And we learned from looking on Wikipedia that I think we should look into this further, because I discovered something else about Wikipedia that I wanted to bring to your attention. I mean, we knew this already, but basically the Wikipedia article about Wilbur Ross said that the Paradise Papers, that Panamanian law firm, I think it's called Mossack Fonseca, revealed that Wilbur Ross failed to disclose his ties to Russian business interests. And I just find it very curious that with all of this indicting and investigating that Robert Mueller is doing, why would he fail to investigate Wilbur Ross for connections to Russia if the overriding narrative is that Donald Trump did something with Russia relative to the US election? It seems very curious, almost as if Wilbur Ross is protected, or there's a lack of interest in pursuing him for some reason other than actually trying to investigate anybody who might be doing anything with Russia.
Well, that comes back to the collage that you so brilliantly put together for the show, because you could equally ask, why did Robert Mueller not pursue the possibility, in fact, the probability, that the anthrax bacteria that were used in the attack on Senate and media leaders after 9/11, the probable source of that was the Porton Down Biological Weapons Research Station. And we talked before the show about the possibility of using or concealing murder for hire by paying people instead of cash, which is relatively easy, traceable, or even Bitcoin, to use carbon credits based on the carbon saved by killing people. Now, when you're shipping anthrax around, anthrax would fall into the category of weapons of mass destruction: chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive. And Porton Down in the UK is a major research center, and they would have stocks of anthrax, because if you wanted to have the antidote, of course, you need the stock to test it with. So just like Novichok and anthrax, apparently what Mueller was supposed to do was send a FBI investigation team, and this, I'm going to talk about the FBI in a minute, to Porton Down to see if a scientist there had smuggled anthrax out, perhaps carried it through the kinetic operation at Boscombe Down into the United States, where it got weaponized with what's known as sabotage spore powder to increase the dispersivity of the bacteria, which is rather heavy and sort of ground hugging. You put the sabotage spore powder, which I believe was produced through a patented pyrotechnical system, mix it with the bacteria, and then you dramatically increase the dispersivity of this stuff. And so when people open an envelope, they inhale it, and then this little stiff stuff gets into the inner cores of the lungs, and you die from inhalation anthrax, which is killed, I think, 5 people in the United States after the 9/11 attack. And for my, the role that I'm trying to develop as with Discovery CSI, if you will, is I think we can put together enough facts to explain those wrongful deaths, let's call them the actus rea, that the injured communities can develop a class action suit against the custodians of the patents that were either negligently, recklessly, willfully, or fraudulently used to cause those deaths. So again, if I may come back to your collage, we've got, at first blush, might look rather confusing to people. Can I just go through the collage to pick out the elements?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so over on the left-hand side at the bottom, you have 343 FDNY at the back of a helmet, and a Motorola radio system, a portable radio system.
Yes.
My allegation is that the firefighters were ambushed in the towers. The first tower to be demolished was the second tower to be hit, which was the South Tower. And when everyone inside that building would have been killed, actually, of course, they were murdered. And there should have been an immediate evacuation order to the firefighters in the North Tower, which is tower number 1. But it looks like the Motorola radios had been sabotaged. Now, who would have been in a position to sabotage the Motorola radios? Well, obviously Motorola, but I presume that it would do it only if it was being extorted. But more interestingly, the patents that Motorola have for the covert transmission of communication signals or even ignition signals for the incendiary bombs in the buildings, they're patented, right? And those patents, I believe, were developed, not necessarily taken out by the company, by McDonnell Detweiler and Associates in the late 60s and through the 70s in their program for the mobile radio data systems, which morphed into Mobile Data International, which McDonnell Detweiler sold to Motorola, which is headquartered in Chicago. So that, coming back to the collage, that's interesting because down on the right-hand side of your collage, you've got the logo CCX for the Chicago Climate Exchange.
Right.
So what I guess I'm saying is, wouldn't it be interesting if Motorola, through its global custodians, that is the people who own the shares of Motorola or the bulk of the shares, had made an arrangement with the people inside the Chicago Climate Exchange that when there was a really effective carbon saving process, the weight of carbon saved by demolishing the buildings, then the people who demolished the buildings got paid with carbon credits through what became, I think in 2003, the Chicago Climate Exchange. Right? So the fascinating possibility here is there have been technologies developed for the covert communication with organized crime groups, I call them Con Air SWAT teams, if you will, where they get paid not in cash for whacking someone, but they get paid in carbon credit, which is then laundered through these dark pool of funds, I believe, created by Wilbur Ross in 1988 with the initial public offering of SERCO shares. Over to you.
Well, so let's get back to Wilbur Ross for a moment, because I want to ask what's led you to that belief. But I found this article here, which is from Forbes, and this was just published in August of this year, talking about new details of Wilbur Ross's business point to a pattern of grifting. And this Dan Alexander is the reporter writing about a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that's been quietly making its way through New York State court system over the last 3 years, pitting a private equity manager named David Storper against his former boss, Wilbur Ross. And they worked side by side at W.L. Ross & Co., where this guy who's brought the suit, so here's the problem with the thing not working. The guy who's brought the suit basically alleges that Ross stole his interest in a private equity fund, transferring them to himself, and tried to cover it up with bogus paperwork. So, I mean, we've got these ongoing lawsuits against this guy alleging theft, and they remember him stealing handfuls of sweet and low packets from a nearby restaurant so he didn't have to buy any. I mean, it's a minor detail, but this article talks about, his penchant for theft, that he's a cheap guy who basically is into screwing people, and we've spoken about how he's an expert at recovering bankrupted businesses, and you spoke about the possibility that he's maybe even helping to bankrupt them. Here we have one of his former colleagues saying he's a pathological liar. So this isn't good.
Well,
and it's just, yeah.
I'm sorry. And of course, there's a kind of swirling of ink and confusion, because when that kind of case is introduced, and it might have great merit, people will glom onto that case and say Wilbur Ross is a bad guy. However, we need to go up, I think, several levels and recognize that if Wilbur Ross is the de facto custodian of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, but he doesn't know that the 4 millionth patent was processed by the British company SERCO it was announced on November the 15th. Not so much necessarily that he's a crook, but he's a fool, or he's ignorant. Because
well, I think he knows, though, doesn't he?
Well, I mean, yeah, but we haven't established that. What I'm saying is, as far as the American public is concerned, I think from a strategic point of view, it is absolute travesty, if not treasonous, to outsource the United States Patent and Trademark Office to the British company SERCO, when SERCO has a record in the United Kingdom of fraud on the government, because about 3,000 alleged criminals or prisoners were transported and charged for when those prisoners were either dead, back in jail, or overseas, or had never been prisoners in the first place. And the company to clear SERCO's directors of fraud, or the police force, was the City of London Police. The point that I'm making is, if there are patents, as you and I know there are, that have been registered at the Patent Office that allow someone to reward prisoners, i.e. the Jerome Lemelson prisoner tracking or parolee tracking system, with artificial intelligence algorithms that calculate what kind of rewards a prisoner might get if they have good behavior. Well, what about the reward of a carbon credit for good behavior of taking those planes down on 911? So strategically, it's really not a matter of whether or not Wilbur Ross is a crook or a grifter. It's a question of, from a strategic point of view, can America afford a commerce secretary who has custody of the Patent Office but doesn't know that the British company that is under investigation in the United Kingdom for the fraudulent movement of prisoners, or charging for the fraudulent movement of prisoners, is actually just processed the 4 millionth patent, and presumably the last patent, which is the 10 millionth patent, was processed by SERCO, and that is the Raytheon patent for building three-dimensional images based on laser illumination of targets. Over to you.
Yeah, and I mean, David, doesn't it seem extremely relevant in that speech where Wilbur Ross was talking about the 10 millionth patent, for me to ask him a question about SERCO, the company processing the patents? It doesn't seem that far removed from what he was discussing that it would be inappropriate for me to ask. I would have hoped that he might answer that question. Now, I'm sure you've seen this article, but I wanted to share it with the viewers and just talk about it for a moment. There's this article here from The Guardian, which of course is a very large British newspaper. This is from July 2017, and it's talking about G4S being awarded a government contract despite a fraud inquiry. And it goes on in the article to talk about how SERCO was also, it says, an SFO investigation into allegations of overcharging in the main electronic monitoring contracts of offenders in England and Wales began in 2013, when a general ban was imposed on G4S and a second company, SERCO, bidding for any government work. So they've been banned from that. And I mean, Wilbur Ross must know damn well what's going on with SERCO and the Patent Office, and it just makes it all the more curious that he didn't want to talk about it.
Well, let me explain going back to your collage and that interesting figure of what appears to be a woman with a nice red dress and nice legs, and you can just make out that she's got her arm around another woman whose face is blanked out. Well, we're now talking about the pig farm, right?
Yes.
Because that woman back in 1992 was called Laurie Shenher, Shenher, and she was a detective constable with the Vancouver Police Department, and she was then thought of herself as a woman, I guess, and she put on the little red dress and went down to the downtown east side and started soliciting and occasionally arresting the Johns who came up and offered her money for sex.
Right.
Now, that means to say, from 1992, right, she would have been in a position to get to know every prostitute working on the downtown east side. And this comes, actually, I'm just going to jump to what I'd like to do, and what I think you and I are already doing, is there were 60 or 50 prostitutes slaughtered, one after the other, between 1996 and 2002 at the pig farm owned by the Picton family, which was registered federally as a society entitled to raise money through sports and entertainment events.
Right.
That is to say, it had the blessing from the federal government, Canadian federal government. It was set itself up as the Piggy Palace Good Time Society. And what I'm coming to here is the probability that the people who went to the raves at the pig farm, and they would have raves with up to 1,500 to 2,000 people. And I don't know if you've ever organized a party or, for 20 people. There's a lot of organization, right?
Yeah.
But 1,500 to 2,000 people going to a pig farm to watch the raves, where it would appear the women taken from the downtown east side were killed in front of an audience of up to 1,500 to 2,000 people, and live snuff films made that were distributed by Starnet Communications from their headquarters at 425 Carroll Street. So this woman who says that she was really upset because the way the women were being treated, she was dressed as a prostitute, right?
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently, she says, well, the Vancouver police, they're full of male chauvinist pigs, notwithstanding that working with the Vancouver police at the time was a guy called Kim Rossmo, who pioneered geographic profiling. And he suggested, with all these women disappearing, that there was a killer out there, a serial killer, and he planned to use his patented geographic profiling to identify the place of work or the home of what transpired was ultimately alleged to be Robert Picton, whose nickname was Willie. He had a brother called David. Yeah, there we are, Laurie Shannon. Anyway, there's this guy, girl, woman, right, who, after getting fed up with the male chauvinism of the Vancouver police, she quits and she becomes a scriptwriter for Da Vinci's Inquest, which is a thriller detective coroner story set in Vancouver.
Huh.
And the particular episodes that she was working on involved the missing women. So
Really?
This is kind of where they drop a docudrama or a movie that looks like it's fictional, but it's calibrated or tied to reality. And I think it serves two purposes. It may be that there are legitimate and honorable scriptwriters in Hollywood, perish the thought, that know that if they declare what really happened on 9/11, they're going to get whacked. So they insinuate it into what looks like fiction, but there's enough fact there that they're hoping one day someone like you or I will pick up the facts. And you remember that comment about the counter-terrorism division that's in Wikipedia, right, of the FBI, where it says they're breeding terrorists.
I wanted to bring that to your attention, David, because I went back to that and it's gone.
It's gone?
Yes, and then I looked up some previous entries on the Internet Archive, and it said in November that they identify those threats. So what it really shows us is that anyone can inject anything into Wikipedia to potentially... So now someone could take that and say, oh, David Hawkins and Jason Goodman were trying to incite panic by telling people that the FBI is doing something with terrorism, but it was written right there, and now it's gone.
Exactly. You see, and so again, that's an extraordinary word, breeding. Let me tell you what Christine Marcy is alleged to have said to her brother, Phil McConnell, about people in general. Now, remember, this is the woman that founded, as I believe, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database in 1984, the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund with Eric Holder in 1984, and the Marshals prisoner transportation system, where she bought a Boeing 737 or a 757 to transport prisoners around. Now, going back to this woman, Laurie Shenher, so she's allegedly looking after the interests of the prostitutes in the downtown east side, the poorest postal code, I think, in Canada. She's dressing as a woman when in fact she's a man. No, correction. She's a man now. She's had an operation and she's, I guess, what you'd call transgendered. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
So she knows enough about the prostitutes to become a scriptwriter for Da Vinci's Inquest. And basically, I think she's very likely to have been the spotter. Now, I don't know if you remember that we have 6 S's to describe the kind of crime scenes that I think we could use discovery to help the victims recover damages through wrongful death. We have the 6 S's of script, spot, shoot, snuff, spin, spoil. Scripting is obvious. It's like writing a script for Erin Brockovich, okay? If you're going to do a script, you're going to have to get actors, you're going to have to get people deployed to mimic or simulate some kind of event. Spotting is very interesting because if you're going to bring your Con Air SWAT teams into a crime scene to whack someone, like the Shermans up in Toronto, or a prostitute abducted from the downtown east side, or the fire chief, Peter Gansey, in New York on 911, you want to make sure that the target is spotted and located before you bring in or put the Con Air SWAT team close to him to whack him, right? Otherwise, you'll have the SWAT team in position, but there's no victim around. And with these high-value targets, very interesting, I think the prostitutes were high-value targets, not so much as because, well, let me tell you what Christine Marcy said about we the people. She described them as mindless breeders and useless breathers. Mindless breeders.
When did she say that?
Useless breathers. She said it to her brother at the funeral ceremony of their father. Right? Now, I don't know the exact context, but the hairs on the back of my neck went up when I thought this woman is probably to this day the most powerful woman in the United States, simply because she knows where more skeletons than you could ever imagine are buried, right? And remember, her first bosses at the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1968, 69, 70, 71 were Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Frank Carlucci, the chairman of the Carlyle Group.
Yeah. I don't trust that guy at all.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. But if you look at these agents, can you imagine the amount of documentary material collected by filming the people at the pig farm during those raves? Some of them would have gone there in good faith, including plainclothes Vancouver police and RCMP people, in the belief that it was a society with a license to run entertainment and sporting events, to raise money, and I'm being cynical here, to get the women off the streets. That bargain did not include taking the women out to the pig farm, killing them, and cooking them at barbecues. There were cannibal feasts out there, Jason.
Now, David,
they found a fridge full of body parts.
Let me share with you some of the things that this viewer had said to me. The mother of her friend who was killed by Robert Pickton, according to the viewer, was certainly not a prostitute, was not a First Nations person. She was white, Caucasian, European descent, not a prostitute, and not killed with a biological dum-dum bullet, but rather injection of draining fluid or drain cleaner or something like that, which was apparently Robert Pickton's preferred method of murder. Do you know anything about that?
Well, yes, I do. That's the allegation in court. Now, the Crown, apparently, of the 50 women, some of whom were run through a meat grinder where the bits were put in the fridge and served up at the cannibal feasts and barbecues for these, 1,700 or 2,000.
How do we know they were
where
served?
There was enough. What?
That's been reported that the people were cooked and served to people?
Yes.
Oh.
But basically, there's a report of a guy who was served with meat from the fridge that he found unusual, that he conjectured was actually human body parts. This is a huge story that ran from 1996 to 2002. And as I say, 1,700 people showed up, but the Crown tried to get accepted into the prosecution of the Crown against Willie Pickton. Of the 6 bodies where there was a fairly substantial component to be analyzed, they all had bullets in them. Now, whether they were dum-dum bullets or whatever, the mechanism that was being set up at the pig farm in conjunction with the Starnet Communications at 425 Carroll Street which was raided on the 20th of August 1999, was because apparently it was suspected of producing and distributing hardcore and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries.
Starnet.
And the raid, there was a Starnet Communications.
Yeah.
Now, what would be the source, the natural source of the hardcore pornography and the child pornography? Well, out at the pig farm.
How do we know that?
Well, we know that there was murders at the pig farm, right? We know that Starnet Communication of distributing hardcore pornography. Again, remember that the basic argument that I'm putting together is I'm looking for a balance of probability argument that the prostitutes died a wrongful death, because you're never, ever going to get a conviction for murder one. So, for example, whilst the initial lawsuit against Willie Picton was he murdered these women, the jury said there's not enough evidence of pre-planning and premeditation, right? He claims to have admitted to killing 50 people, but he said he didn't act alone, right? So the Crown was not able to get admitted in the court that the bodies had been shot with bullets, because that's a different MO. As you point out, Willie Picton is accused of injecting fluid, antifreeze or something into the bodies of the women. But in each case, all of these crimes, I believe, are structured so there's a potential for betting on the length of time it takes for someone to die, whether they've been injected with antifreeze or whether they've been shot with a biological bullet of the type invented by Darrell Rubin, R-U-B-I-N.
Right.
But
we've seen that.
The point that I'm
patent in
making
the
is.
past.
Go ahead.
Well, we've seen that patent for the biological bullets in the past.
Yes, and my point is that this dark pool of funds, I believe, structured by Wilbur Ross, working at N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited for SERCO, for the IPO. The shareholdings in SERCO are very, very bizarre, and they're much more closely aligned to creating SERCO as a dark pool than a conventional company like Boeing, because now SERCO is all over the United States government. Remember that Wilbur Ross said to you, the United States Patent and Trademark Office is an arm of government and it manages itself. Now, he's being disingenuous, stupid, or lying, or whatever, because the United States Patent and Trademark Office does not manage itself if it's outsourced the processing of patents to the British company SERCO, which has now run through, 4 millionth patent, including the 10 millionth patent, which is this Raytheon patent. Now, you remember that when I started to go through that Raytheon patent and the news about the 10 millionth patent, I found, to my horror and amazement, and the hairs on the back of my neck went up, a picture that indicated what an image would look like when subjected to the kind of technology patented by Raytheon. And lo and behold, you've got the Ground Zero complex with this devastating image, which indicates, or should indicate, and presumably does indicate, to the dead firefighters or the families of the dead firefighters, doesn't matter who you are or where you are, we can get you. Yeah. And we can get away with it. Because you see those two, go ahead.
It's just also quite strange that they would show this image so many years after 9/11, to promote the issuance of that patent. It seems like they would have a lot of other stuff they've imaged since 2001.
Of course they did, but the purpose of that image, which I think underlines what happened at the pig farm, is to send a warning to people, right? Like if there are any firefighters, and that's why I think, with this Patreon, and I'm very much in favor of Patreon at the moment because it gives me some income. But what I'm very concerned about is these people can interfere with any organization that sets up the kind of service Patreon does and says, all right, well, get rid of that guy, take that off, etc., hate, etc., etc. So all of the avenues by which people like us try and reach the public are liable to be curtailed or filtered or actually shut down, which is why I urge the people who are listening to join us in this discovery process, where I think you and I don't know anywhere else in the world who can do we can actually do online discovery of finding the facts at a crime scene, like the fact of that image, the one that's just you were just showing. Because if you go back to the Federal Bridge, sitting over on the right are the 4 or 5 defense contractors that would have been, or could have been, their patents could have been activated on 911 by the custodian of the patents to engage in the 911 attack. And Phil McConnell and myself believe, well, it's mainly Phil who told me that was the most likely delivery of the weapon, that a Raytheon A3 Sky Warrior, highly modified, would have dropped off an air-to-ground missile, probably, that patented, hardened, rocket-boosted bunker buster from Lockheed Martin, that punched a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon, killed everyone in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Office. Now, I am an expert in explosives. I've worked with them, most of my career in the oil industry. I didn't build explosives. I built IEDs that were specially structured to go down oil wells and punch holes through and allow the oil to flow back the other way. But I taught how to handle explosives, et cetera, and I'm telling you that it would be extremely difficult to design an ad hoc explosive that would punch a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon, create a 14-foot diameter hole in the inner courtyard with about, I'm estimating, 1.5 tons of debris, and along that route actually kill everyone in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. Essentially what I'm saying is that was a strategic target, and it required a combination of patented devices and people who had custody of those patented devices to take out the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, which is a major strategic target, and then reward the people who did so without attracting attention. And I'm suggesting the people who did so, which is I would say it's a Con Air SWAT team, probably in the custody or part custody of Christine Marcy, who founded Con Air. And I think they were rewarded with carbon credits paid through this trust or dark pool of funds built by Wilbur Ross for SERCO. Over to you.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to be focusing on when we switch over to Patreon, and people can watch that discussion by going now onto patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. David and I will be resuming at 3 p.m. Eastern. Of course, that's going to be noon Pacific. And I'm very interested in this conversation, David, about the carbon credits. And it's interesting because it seems like anything that can be done to obfuscate the activity. Here we've got a woman who became a man. That's confusing in and of itself. Now we've got 2 pictures of 2 people that look distinctly different, are without getting into this debate, let's call it 2 different sexes or whatever. That's confusing. Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is this the same person? Is this a different person? That obfuscates it. When we're paying people not in dollars or bank wire transfers, I mean, certainly when you conduct legitimate business, you wire transfer, you send a check, there's lots of records of those transactions. When you want to do things like murder for hire or have these Con Air SWAT teams and you want to compensate people for doing illegal activities, obviously there's an interest in obfuscating the payment method to the greatest extent possible. And I think we need to talk a bit more about this Chicago Climate Exchange. It's a very strange thing, and I didn't know until this week or last week that this was created in part by our buddy Al Gore and this person Richard Sandor. So it seems very much like we should know more about the Chicago Climate Exchange and any potential financial benefit that Al Gore might get from producing a movie like The Inconvenient Truth and trying to convince everyone that they should be, spending money to purchase carbon credits when they travel on a plane or whatever. But the point is, the Chicago Climate Exchange creates essentially a trading environment for these financial instruments that are basically made out of thin air. And if it's a unit of value, whether it's the Chicago Climate Exchange changing around carbon credits or some cryptocurrency like Steemit.com that I've identified, seems to operate in a similar way. criminals trading something of value for doing something that's very difficult to trace. We've seen they've posted instructions for how to essentially money launder the cryptocurrency through that system. But David, you and I will be carrying on with this conversation and going even more in depth in just 15 minutes from now at patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I hope to have an alternative to Patreon set up for us by January, but I hope that our viewers will stay with us on Patreon right now, and we will in due time be taking steps to move away from Patreon, because we certainly support the First Amendment, but we can't just completely collapse the financial support for the effort here right now. So David, I'll see you in just 15 minutes.
Thank you, Jason.
See everybody there. Thanks.